ਇੱਥੇ ਆਏ ਨੇ ਅੱਜ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਸੰਡੇ ਵਾਲੇ ਦਿਨ ਔਰ ਬੜੇ ਅੱਛੇ ਟਾਈਮ ਸਿਰ ਆ ਗਏ ਨੇ So I formally welcome you all on this 40th anniversary of the massacre of Sikhs in Delhi. Genocide of Sikhs in 84 is a black period in the history of India, free India. Before we start the proceeding, we'll have one-time Mool Mantra, followed by 1 minute silence, our homage to the departed souls. Then we take up the session one by one. So kindly join me for a Mool Mantra and seek the blessing of the Almighty. Ek Onkar Satnam Karta Purakh Nirvo Nirvair Akal Murat Ajuni Saibham Gur Prasad. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. And I request everybody to stand up for 1 minute. Let's pay our homage. Thank you. And when we think of 84 and what we saw in Delhi is unbelievable and any society cannot accept. In a free India like this, of something of this nature happening on a large scale. So while formally welcome you once again, who have joined us today, on this 40th anniversary of November 84 program in post-independent India, we are still struggling Kindly settle down. We are struggling with the question of memory, impunity, offshore acknowledgement of the event, lack of justice and repatriation, and large-scale collective and individual trauma. Similar programs follow November 84. In a different target community, which in a sense means nothing has been learned by the Indian society, state, politicians, and institutions. But the question keeps returning to our mind of all right-thinking citizens how to ensure an end to genocidal violence in India and elsewhere, why it is important to stand in solidarity with communities all over the world who demand an end to state-sponsored genocide against humanity. Not taking more time, I request our President, Ravinder Singh Huja, to say a few words before we start the proceeding.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you all for being here. As I pen down my thoughts, I am drawn to a momentous chapter in our history, a chapter that pulsates with the beating heart of Sikhi. The intricate weave of our faith interlaces with threads of valor, resilience, and unyielding devotion. Events of 1984 are etched in the collective memory of Sikhs worldwide. Amidst the tumult, the defenders marched forth with love in their hearts, Simran in their breath, and Siddiq as their anchor as they entered the court of Shahidi. 1984 for us is not just an occurrence, but a visual where the echoes of courage resonate louder than before. It reminds us to be determined in our resolve for justice. Remembering Shaheeds is a Sikh tradition, and we remember 1984 Shaheeds. We draw our strength in their honor. We carry forward the torch of their Sikhi, for we are the torchbearers of their legacy, the guardians of their vision. We must march forward, undeterred and resolute, as saint warriors of light, as heralds of peace. How bad was 1984 can be demonstrated by me being chased by goons in a leading nursing home of Delhi, as my daughter had just been born, and I ended up sleeping in a locked room. I was lucky to survive. Yes, my thoughts cannot stray far away from the shadows of October 31st. The 1984 genocide weighs heavily on my spirits. Why do tears come so freely? Why does my heart ache as if the fires still burn? I see the faces of those who looked like my father, my brothers, my uncles, those who wore the same faith in their eyes, those who dared to talk with dignity. I see my mothers, my sisters, and my daughters in their strength, even as justice eludes them. And the tears flow still. They wait, yet stand undeterred, facing a state that betrays its promise of justice. I stand with them in spirit and memory because their only fault was being a Sikh, so I remember. These are words from Inikord's essay on 31st October 2024. What needs to be done? We've discussed that many times on this forum. Some of them are an apology in the parliament by the government, a serious effort to rehabilitate the victims, a truth commission, punishment of the guilty, and the list goes on. 1984 started a pattern in India where state actors can facilitate and encourage massacres of minorities, and the guilty will walk away freely. We must stand together in solidarity against the events which jeopardize the very conscience of a community. We must forgive, but not forget. The guilty must be prosecuted, but as justice gets delayed, we get dismayed and disillusioned. Isn't it ironic that post-1984, it takes a single incident to change the perception of our community from patriots to Khalistanis? We will not let questionable motives and elements succeed who attempt to reopen our healed wounds and align us with the Khalistani separatist movements, potentially for political gains. The Sikhs, the Khalsa, is strong in love, it's strung in love. They are nirbhav and nirvair in our resolve. But we seek closure and justice. We must honor the memory of brothers and sisters we lost in 1984 by focusing on the future and building a community that is prospering with Gursikh youth, which is educated and committed to the Gurus. Sikh history is testament to our resilience and our capacity for forgiveness and growth. Let us carry forward the legacy of those who suffered, not through resentment or political maneuverings, but through a commitment of ensuring that such dark events are not repeated anywhere in the world. In unity and remembrance, we move forward, not just for ourselves, but for generations of Sikhs to come. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
We now start with our first session. That's the violence, memory, and pains. I request all the panelists to kindly come up on the dais before I start reading their biodatas briefly. Mrs. Siddharth Vadarajan. Somebody can escort them. You have the Amarjit Singh Narang and Urship Daliaj. Out. And Air Marshal Bangu. As a token of our appreciation, we'd like to present a bouquet to all the panelists. The first panelist is Mr. Siddharth Varadarajan. He was born 1965. Siddharth Varadarajan is the founding editor of The Wire. He was earlier the editor of The Hindu from 2011 to 2013 and is a recipient of the Ramnath Goenka Award for Journalists. He has taught economics at New York University and journalism at University of California, Berkeley, besides working at the Times of India and the Center for Public Affairs and Critical Theory, Shivnadar University. Our next panelist is Urshi Bhutalia, born 1952, is an Indian feminist writer, a publisher and an activist. She is known for her work in the women's movement of India, as well as for such as The Other Side of the Silence, Voice from and from the Partition of India, and Speaking Peace, Women Voices from Kashmir. And these are all award-winning books. Known for co-founding Kali for Women, India's first feminist publishing house, and running Zuban Books, an imprint of Kali. Awards, she's won a lot of awards. To start with, she received the Padma Shri Award. She is also a visiting faculty member at the Ashoka University, Vedka Scholars, Anant National University, and the Naropi Fellowship. Just a very, very brief I try to give it. Probably you all know about what all she's been involved with. The next panelist is Professor Amarjit Singh Narang. With a PhD from Political Science from University of Delhi, a former professor of political science, coordinator, human rights education and registrar, Indira Gandhi Open University. She has been fellow at Brooke, McGill and Queen's University and Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. Dr. Narang has authored and edited 8 books. His recent book on Akali Dal 100 was released last year. The area of interest includes Indian politics, ethnic studies, and Punjab and Sikh affairs. He is founding member of the Sikh Forum. We come next to our moderator, Air Marshal Paramjit Singh Bangu. Air Marshal Bangu was born in village Ukhlana, Hisar district and studied in Sainik School, Kunjpura. He joined Indian Air Force as fighter pilot. At the age after retiring, he had retired after 38 years of glorious service as Air Marshal. He was specially selected on a flying instructor and other military diplomat missions overseas in Russia. He was finally assigned responsibility of the West Indian Command of the Air Force and was responsible for national security of aerospace and offensive action if needed across the national border. President of India has been pleased to honor the officer with Vayu Sena Medal, Ati Vishesh Medal, and Param Vishesh Seva Medal. He spends his time in social activities, adventure camp, and motivational talks to the student and to the school and the college students. He is a keen golfer. I would now request the panelists to start the proceeding one by one, and starting with Mr. Saddam.
Distinguished members of the Sikh Forum, Marshal Bhangu, my fellow panelists, and members of the audience. Today is really quite an extraordinary day. All of us, at least those who had reached childhood or adulthood in November '84, have very clear memories of where we were that day, what happened to us, what we were thinking, what happened to our loved ones, what happened to friends, family. And quite frankly, I had hoped for a different kind of 40th anniversary than what we are experiencing today. I was a student, college student, in November '84. I wasn't even in India at the time. I was in England. As you can see from my name and those who know me, I'm not from a Sikh family, not Punjabi. But that didn't make the pain any less. To imagine what is happening in the capital city of your own country, by those elected to protect citizens, under the watchful eye of men in uniform, who all had taken oaths on the Constitution to uphold law and order, under the watchful gaze of reporters and editors, whose job it was to report truthfully, accurately, and honestly what is happening in society, what's happening in the country, what's happening on the ground. Under the watchful gaze of men and women in black coats, the judiciary, whose job it was to do complete justice and to hold the executive to account. All of this happened from October the 31st, 1984 onwards. It happened under the watchful gaze, and this I find particularly astonishing and unbelievable, that this could happen in a city that was then the site of visiting dignitaries from all over the world. So the entire gaze of the world leaders, world media was on India and Delhi at the time. And to then fast forward 40 years from now, to imagine that we are still, as a country, as a society, looking for justice, looking for answers, trying to ask ourselves, how do we ensure that this kind of crime doesn't happen again? And it is the large-heartedness of the Sikh who today, in her or his moment of pain and suffering, recognizes that what was visited upon them in November 84 continues to be visited upon innocent Indians of different religions under one excuse or the other. And no Sikh sees her or his struggle for justice when it comes to 84 as any different from the struggle for justice of the people of Malyana and Hashimpura near Meerut, who were killed in 1987 by members of the Uttar Pradesh Provincial Armed Constabulary, or the victims of Gujarat in 2002, or Muzaffarnagar or Assam. And all of you feel the same sense of that wound being reopened every time you hear a leader, a prime minister, a minister, a chief minister talking communal filth against Muslims in the current scenario, or against Christians, under one pretext or the other, spreading hate, trying to divide Indians. I don't think in November 84, even in the darkest of days of that time, we had imagined that 40 years from then, India would still be saddled with this kind of nonsense. Friends, this session is on violence, memories, and pain. The pain, as you know, never really goes away, because a genocide was attempted in one's own home, by one's own, not to put too fine a point, by one's own government. How does that pain ever go away? The pain stays and gets worsened because of the forgetting and the silence that surrounds us. The forgetting and the silence which followed, the ease with which people in this country and the world went back to their normal lives, the ease with which they then allowed similar crimes to be committed in their names. And the question of memory is really a question of who remembers and who forgets. I applaud the Sikh Forum for organizing this event today. But is it too much to hope that when we come to the 45th anniversary or the 50th anniversary, such an event will be organized by a group, say, called the Hindu Forum, which decides that what happened in November 84 was an affront to India, was an affront to everybody who tried to act and commit crimes in the names of Hindus. Is it too much to hope for that by the time the 50th anniversary comes around, an event of this kind could be organized by those who themselves were involved in the commission of this crime? The state. Is it too much to expect that in a democratic India, in a country that swears by Baba Sahib Ambedkar and the Constitution, Gandhi, that claims to abide by a religious tradition going back thousands of years, is it too much to ask that the Indian state itself one day feel obliged, feel duty-bound to commemorate this massacre, to do complete justice, to apologize? Certainly back in November 84 and after, when all of us were struggling for justice, all of us were struggling to demand accountability, I for one never imagined that this would take more than 40 years. I never imagined that today we would be exactly in a similar situation to where we were then. In many ways worse, actually. In those days, you could have a prime minister talk in riddles, that when a big tree falls, the earth is bound to shake. There was still a certain hesitancy in openly maligning, vilifying, targeting the Sikh community in a continuous, unabated fashion. There was still some shame. But today, when you listen to the kind of statements, and it pains me to say this, but that the Prime Minister of India makes about Muslims, there was a calculation made in the 2024 election campaign, 110 out of 173 speeches that he made, there were vicious, direct, targeted attacks on Muslim Indians. And that tells you the distance, the backward distance that we have traveled since 84. Friends, it's not the crime. People often say, because cases are dragging on and we're going to have a session that's going to look at the problem of justice, the functioning of the legal system. And in many, many cases of mass crime, the fact is that the record of punishment is pathetic. Courts, police, all throw their hands up and say, we can't do anything about this. Guilty, walk free. But in my view, it's not the crime and the evidence of the crime that you collect which explains what happens. It's the cover-up. More than the crime, I urge you to look at all the evidence of cover-up. Because when you look at the cover-up, you then understand who had an interest in committing this crime and therefore who committed this crime. I can accept, for argument's sake, that a prime minister who was 2 days into the job, who had no political experience, was not paying attention to what was happening before his own eyes in the city. But a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, to not want justice to be done to your own people, to not ensure that those who were involved in this violence are thoroughly investigated, that to my mind is unforgivable. The Chief Minister of Gujarat can say, I got a clean chit for what happened in 2002. But can he answer why he did nothing to investigate the crimes which took place in Gujarat under his own watch, why it was necessary for cases to be moved out of Gujarat to have justice done. So it's the cover-up that tells you everything you need to know about the crime. And it pains me to say this, but my own profession, the media, was also part of this cover-up. You have to read media coverage of 84. The Sikh Forum has brought copies of Who Are the Guilty. It took, 2 or 3 weeks after the genocide for the facts to be brought out before the people of India in the form of booklets. This at a time when we had a thriving, India takes great pride in having a free press. But if you read the papers of those days, other than stray observations about how violence took place and the police did nothing, you will find no information at all about the presence of politicians like Jagdish Titler or H.K.L. Bhagat or Sajjan Kumar in the newspapers of the day. You will have no evidence of the fact that the police allowed the massacre to happen on its own watch. And I cannot think of a bigger failing than what the media did at the time. Worse, I would say that sections of the media then were also enablers in spreading rumors, spreading hatred against Sikhs. You recall the kind of coverage that took place throughout 1984, blaming ordinary Sikhs for acts of terrorism, blaming ordinary Sikhs for the killing of Hindus in Punjab, helping to fuel and spread rumors of one kind or the other. And today when you turn on the television and you watch in these Godi channels, program after program, anchors, guests spewing venom and hatred against Muslims, you see, and before your own eyes, the role of the media as an enabler. And it also pains me to say that the judiciary and that category, unique category of Indian person known as a retired judge, they've also served as enablers. One man, Ranganath Mishra, who was entrusted with doing the kind of work that PUDR did in 2 weeks. Justice Tarkunde, Amiya Rao, there were 3 reports of this kind that came out. In 2 or 3 weeks, they gathered all the evidence that you needed. And it took Ranganath Mishra, God knows how long, to decide that nothing could be found. He then goes to the Rajya Sabha. This is the caliber of person we're talking about. There seems to be a special place from where these kind of gentlemen are selected to do the job of whitewashing. But I don't want to fault any 1 or 2 or dozen individuals, because the Indian Constitution gives the higher judiciary in India the right to do complete justice, to intervene and take stock when there is manifest injustice happening before your own eyes. And here, sadly, the names of those who have distinguished themselves is few and far between. I'm thrilled to see copies of Justice, the Muralidhar bench judgment in Sajjan Kumar, which has redeemed to some extent the image of the Indian judiciary. Not just because he delivered justice and ensured that one of the guilty of 1984, the Congress leader Sajjan Kumar, was sent to jail where he belongs, but also because the bench saw the connection that we all see before our own eyes between November 84, Gujarat 2002, Muzaffarnagar, the violence before and the violence after. That there is a system that was put in place in November 84, and unless that system is uprooted, destroyed, and the guilty, those who engineered and designed and implement the system, are punished, we will always be condemned to repeat these kinds of acts of monstrous violence against our people. I want to end just with another thought. A few years ago, there was the controversy about creating a police memorial in Chanakyapuri. And a lot of the discussion focused on the design. What kind of memorial is this? It looks ugly and so on and so forth. And me and some friends were discussing that there should be no memorial for Delhi police until Delhi police is held accountable for what happened in November 84. How can you memorialize police in the capital city of a country which allowed, if at all there should be a memorial, there should be a memorial to the victims. And the police should be forced to come there and apologize and lay a wreath and pay tribute to the memory of those who they allowed to be killed. Let us live and hope and dream and fight for a day where this kind of a memorial would be possible in a new India, and where it will not be left to the Sikh Forum to remember and pay tribute to the memories of those who died, but that Hindu forums and government forums and civil society forums in large number would share this burden, share this pain, and together we then find a way to move ahead. Thank you.
I think he has forcefully borrowed the points. I request the second speaker to kindly come up on the dais or from there wherever she wants.
ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਜੀ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਸਿੱਖ ਫੋਰਮ ਦਾ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ ਅਦਾ ਕਰਦੀ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਅੱਜ ਮੌਕਾ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਗੱਲ ਰੱਖਣ ਦੇ ਅਤੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਇਜਾਜ਼ਤ ਨਾਲ ਮੈਂ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ 'ਚ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਾਂਗੀ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਆਡੀਅנס ਵਿੱਚ ਕਾਫੀ ਲੋਕ ਹੈਗੇ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਸਮਝਦੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਅਤੇ ਸਿਧਾਰਥ ਵਗੈਰਾ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਵੀ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ 'ਚ ਗੱਲ ਰੱਖੀ ਹੈ ਅਤੇ ਵਿਦ ਯੋਰ ਪਰਮਿਸ਼ਨ ਆਈ ਸਵਿਚ ਓਵਰ ਟੂ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਨਾਓ As Siddharth said, we are marking 40 years of 1984, and the memory of that time does not go away easily. I was a young woman then, and I was in the India International Center when we got the news of Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. At that time, there were no cell phones or anything. So it was through a conversation among drivers in the parking lot as I went out to fetch my car and drive away that I got an idea of what had happened. There was no confirmation. There was a very strong rumor, but then some of the drivers had heard it on the radio. And I remember going home that day full of fear for what might happen socially, full of fear for what might happen personally, full of fear for what might happen to our neighbors and to everybody around us. By the evening of that day, this city in which I had grown up and spent almost all my life after my parents moved here from Punjab, had transformed into an ugly space of violence. And it is really difficult to imagine it now for those of us who haven't seen it. But the fear was palpable. You could hear people shouting on the streets. By the next day, you saw buses burnt and lying on the streets. You saw tires which were on fire. And we came to know of the massive scale on which people had been impacted, killed in the places where they lived. One of the remarkable moments of that time, which I think is also worth remembering when we recall these memories, is of the speed with which almost the next day civil society groups came together. So it was possible for civil society to mobilize at a time when there were no cell phones and very few ways of communicating with each other. Civil society groups came together in the form of gurdwaras who set up langars, who started to collect food, also in the form of a very large group called Nagarik Ekta Manch, with whom I worked as a volunteer. And Nagarik Ekta Manch would meet in Lajpat Bhavan every morning, and hundreds of us would turn up, and we were given curfew passes to go and work in the different camps where people were. My responsibility was in the Shakarpur camp near Gita Colony, where, and it was that responsibility that pushed me as a young Indian woman to start to think about the ways in which such violence played out in our country, and to start to think about what had happened at partition. And it pushed me to study partition, because when we were working in the camps, I was given the responsibility to take down people's testimonies. And it's when I started listening to those testimonies that people kept referring to partition. And they kept saying, ਅਸੀਂ ਕਦੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੋਚਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਆਪਣੇ ਮੁਲਕ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਹੋਏਗਾ, ਆਪਣੇ ਲੋਕੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਕਰਨਗੇ. And that made me think how the pain of a moment like this lives on in our society, in our families, and how we actually never really pay attention to it. My own family, a family of partition refugees, had carried with it the history of violence and partition, the history of division, and despite the fact that it was an alive history in my family, I had never paid attention to it. I had taken as truth what was taught to us in our schools and colleges, that was the truth of partition. And that was only a partial truth. It was 1984 that pushed me to look back at partition and to try and uncover the histories of grief, of violence, the histories that remained hidden, the histories without which an understanding of a moment like this in our history cannot ever be complete. I think those of us who saw 84, those of us who have inherited its legacies of pain and sorrow and grief and violence and the divisions it created in our society, we carry that responsibility with us to not forget that moment and to not let it be forgotten. I know that we have the Sikh Forum and many others, lawyers, civil society groups have continued to battle for justice for the survivors of that time, and that is a battle that needs to keep being fought. But I think there is also another battle that we as people who belong to this society need to continue to fight, need to continue to be involved in, and that is the battle to keep memory alive, to keep alive the memory of pain, to keep alive the act of listening to the survivors, not only about that moment when their lives were disrupted, but also about the many years that have passed since then, during which the survivors, many of them women, have actually shown us how resilient they can be, have shown us how women adapt to the most difficult of situations. And I think it is our responsibility to receive that memory, to listen to it, to keep it alive, to share it, because memory is another form of justice, listening and keeping the memory alive. Memory is a form of healing. Memory is also a kind of responsibility that we have on us as a society which should take part in keeping alive the histories which otherwise the state and conventional history will disappear from our lives. If you look at other moments in our history, Siddharth mentioned some. I will mention two different incidents, if one can call them that. One was some 5 years after 1984, the Bhagalpur violence that took place in Bhagalpur, in which about 1,000 Muslims were killed. And shortly after that, the 1989 Bhagalpur violence, and shortly after that, the 1991 moment in Kashmir, where two villages, Kunan and Poshpora, were subjected to a search and seizure operation, and where a large number of women were sexually assaulted during that search and seizure operation. In recent years, After the 2012 violence in Delhi, where a young woman was sexually assaulted on a moving bus, young women from Kashmir who had been completely oblivious to the history of Kunan Poshpora, because other than the newspapers in which that history had appeared, it had disappeared from pretty much all easily accessible public record. It was the 2012 violence that pushed these young women lawyers to start exploring their own history, to start asking the question that when we hear of sexual violence in the capital city of Delhi, the entire world gets to know of it, but what about in our own backyard? What happened then? And one of them phoned up the other one and said, "Do you remember Kunan Poshpora?" And from that, started an exercise of recovering memory, talking to the survivors of that violence, many of whom had died, which eventually resulted in a book that records that moment, and a book that is owned by all the survivors of that time as their own history. And I think this is a responsibility we carry, which many of us in our separate ways have done. The Sikh Forum has created an archive. Many others have created documents and different forms of witnessing, photographs, and so on and so forth. And I think one of our responsibilities also is to try to find a way in which that valuable material can be linked together, can be accessible one from the other, so that these multiple histories are available to us. I want to add one last thing, that in recent years also, another history of 84 has begun to come to light, which is a very disturbing history, and that is the history of sexual assault of women during 1984. Many of us who worked with the victims, with the survivors of the violence at that time, and I can see people in the audience who were there with all the groups that worked, this was something we did not see, even though many of us came from feminist groups and were extremely alive to the ways in which histories of sexual violence are very much part of genocidal moments, very much part of sectarian violence, but we did not see it apart from an incident or two. In recent years, there has been some uncovering of these histories which suggests that it happened on a much larger scale than we actually thought. And I think although the uncovering of such histories may be very uncomfortable for us as a community, because histories of shame are often just kept aside, and they may be very difficult histories to uncover, because the women themselves who have lived through that moment would not only want to not remember it often, but possibly do not even have the words to describe it, the vocabulary to talk about it. So how do we as a society start to address this deep silence in our history? How do we bring it out without making the women vulnerable, without letting it impact their lives? So the recovery of the histories of pain is not an easy job. It comes with a lot of not only responsibility, but ethical questions that attach to it. And I think at this moment, when we are 4 decades into this history, it is both a moment when we should not allow ourselves to obliterate this history if it really exists, but we should exercise both caution and sensitivity and empathy and responsibility in recovering it. And once we have done that, we need to see how we can put that out in the public without making people vulnerable, people who have lived through that time, and that is another responsibility. So the whole question of doing work on memories of pain and suffering is not something that has a finite end where it can be done once for all and done and dusted and put away, but it is a bit like, as I have sometimes said in the past, like starting to peel an onion. When you start it, you take off one layer, another layer emerges, and until you get to the heart, which is the core of it, which holds also many, many things inside it. And I think as a society, perhaps that is one of the responsibilities we need to carry forward. I will end here by thanking the Sikh Forum again and thanking all of you for listening. And I hope that we are able to take this particular part of our search forward as well in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rishiji. You covered a lot of areas. It's for the information of all. We have a website, the Sikh Forum, newdelhi.org, which is undergoing upgradation, and we are trying to cover up and post the load with information about June 84 and November 84. There's going to be video recording and audio also in times to come. The intention is to keep the public and the youth in touch with the realities of June and November 84. So it will be, it's already getting upgraded gradually, but we will be doing it fully within the next couple of months so that everybody can be benefited. Thank you very much once again. And we have the third, our Honorable Dr. Namadji Singh Naren. He is a founding member of the Sikh Forum, under whose hand a lot of things have changed and still are changing. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratap ji, and thank you, Chair. Let me first say that because of certain personal reasons, I was not in a position to make even articulated extempore presentation. Therefore, what I have done is made a written statement which I'll read, and wherever required, I'll translate that in Punjabi also. And first, for the information of my co-panelists, I am one of those who on the night of 31st October was on Ring Road riding my scooter. So I am one of the lucky persons who survived, and also I am one of those who in our younger age at that time ideologically were committed to Marxism and socialism, and then became Sikhs and became founders of the Sikh Forum, because the cause is not only for the Sikhs but for a society as a whole. Chair, I think if I take 2 or 3 minutes extra, you'll excuse me. You see, much has been said, and पिछले 40 साल तो ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਡਿਸਕਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਕੀ ਹੋਇਆ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਮਰੇ ਉਸ ਗੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਕੱਟ ਕਰਕੇ ਅੱਜ ਕੁਝ 2 ਨਵੀਆਂ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਕਹਿਣੀਆਂ ਚਾਹਾਂਗਾ। ਉਹ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਤੇ ਹੈ ਕਿ 40 ਸਾਲ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਮੌਕਾ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਨੂੰ, ਸਟੇਟ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਣ ਦਾ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕੀ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਹੈ, ਕੀ ਕਰਨਾ ਹੋਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਹੈ। ਦੂਸਰਾ, ਇੱਕ ਉਹ ਚੀਜ਼ ਜਿਹਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਪਿਛਲੇ 40 ਸਾਲਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਕਿਸੇ ਕਾਰਨ ਕਰਕੇ ਅਵੋਇਡ ਕਰਦੇ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, ਕਹਿਣ ਤੋਂ ਡਰਦੇ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, ਸ਼ਾਇਦ 40 ਸਾਲ ਬਾਅਦ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਉਹ ਮੌਕਾ ਵੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਇੰਟਰਸੈਪਸ਼ਨ ਕਰਨੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਕਿਉਂ ਹੁੰਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਔਰ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀਜ਼ ਨੂੰ ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਸੋਚਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ, ਕੀ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਮੈਂ ਇਹ 2 ਗੱਲਾਂ ਬੇਸਿਕਲੀ ਅੱਜ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹਾਂਗਾ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ 40 ਸਾਲਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਸਿਰਫ ਇਹੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਫਲਾਣੇ ਨੇ ਕੀਤਾ। ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਠੀਕ ਹੈ। ਸੋ ਮੈਂ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ ਹਾਂ। ਦੇयर इज अ कॉमन सेइंग दैट टाइम इज ग्रेट हीलर। आम तौर पर कहते हैं ना कि जख्म वक्त जख्म ਨੂੰ ਭਰ ਦਿੰਦਾ, but some wounds don't get easily healed unless treated well and in time. Maybe not in body, but those wounds remain in memory and keep on hurting the conscious. Such is the case for Sikhs about the decade of 1980s. मैं सिर्फ 84 ਦੇ ਜੈਨੋਸਾਈਡ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ, 80s 1980s ਦਾ ਸਾਰਾ ਕੁਝ ਕਵਰ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼, but things are interlinked, so I'll make them. At least for the generation then old enough and able to see, feel, understand and remember. ਮੇਰੀ ਜਨਰੇਸ਼ਨ, ਬਟਾਲੀਆ ਜਨਰੇਸ਼ਨ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਦੇਖੀਆਂ, ਸਮਝੀਆਂ ਉਹ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਭੁੱਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਕਦੇ, but also for the younger generation conscious of their identity and future. Every Sikh worth its name of that and subsequent generations continue to feel the pain of those years and deep hurt and suffering of indignity, humiliation, and loss of pride. Why? First, First, on the account of attack on the holiest of their shrines, the Harmandir Sahib. ਸਾਡੇ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਜੈਨੋਸਾਈਡ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਹੀ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਹੋਏਗਾ ਜੋ ਅਟੈਕ ਹੋਇਆ। ਐਂਡ ਸੈਕਿੰਡ, ਸਾਡੇ ਇੱਕ ਦੋਸਤ ਹੈ ਦੀਪਾਂਕਰ ਗੁਪਤਾ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਸੀ, ਇਫ ਐਨੀ ਪ੍ਰਾਈਡ ਵਾਸ ਲੈਫਟ ਆਫਟਰ ਦੀ ਮੈਸੇਕਰ ਆਫ ਦੇਅਰ ਨੰਬਰ ਇਨ ਆਪਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਬਲੂ ਸਟਾਰ, ਈਵਨ ਦੈਟ ਵਾਸ ਬੀਇੰਗ ਫੋਰਸਡ ਆਊਟ ਔਨ ਦੀ ਸਟਰੀਟਸ। तो दोनों चीज़ें लिंक हो रही हैं। The pain is not only for those who suffer loss of their dears and dears, property, molestation of women folk, dignity, or any of such like. It is for every Sikh who remember, खास करके दिल्ली वाले, self-imposed arrest in their homes. ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਘਰਾਂ 'ਚ ਗ੍ਰਿਫਤਾਰ ਕਰ ਲਿਆ ਸੀ, ਅਰੈਸਟਡ ਹਾਂ। आजकल digital arresting, this was a thought of arresting within their homes. Listen justification for the killings from the highest levels of governance. Siddharth mentioned it. Tolerated humiliation on the basis of false accusation and rumors. पानी जहर मिलाता, गड्डियां पार के आ रही हैं. Again, Siddhartha mentioned in this. So I'm not going into the details. Anyhow, commemoration of the 14th anniversary of horrendous events of 1904, while remind us and the society of the pain, suffering, and injustices, also gives us an opportunity to the state to address the genuine feelings of hurt and alienation of the Sikh community and give them a sense of fairness and justice. If not done, hardliners in Punjab and outside India can use it as an handle to revive juvenate radical agenda. I'll come to that later on. At the same time, this is also an opportunity for the Sikh community for some introspection and learning of the lessons. I'll touch on these points. Let me start with the first. Let me quote Kirpal Dhillon IPS, a Madhya Pradesh DGP ਸੀਗੇ। ਇਮੀਡੀਏਟਲੀ ਆਫਟਰ ਬਲੂ ਸਟਾਰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ DGP ਲਗਾ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਸੀ, ਔਰ ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਜਿਸ ਦਿਨ ਹਰਚੰਦ ਸਿੰਘ ਲੋਂਗੋ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਦਾ ਅਸੈਸੀਨੇਸ਼ਨ ਹੋਇਆ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇੱਕਦਮ ਕੱਢ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਸੀ। ਹੀ ਵਾਸ ਡਿਕਲੇਅਰ ਇਰਰਿਸਪੌਂਸਿਬਲ। ਐਨੀਹਾਉ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇੱਕ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਲਿਖੀ ਹੈ, ਉਹਦੇ 'ਚ ਆਈ ਕੋਟ ਫਰੋਮ ਹਿਮ। ਹੀ ਸੇਜ਼, the Sikh children who had been mute and terrified, there are ਸੁਣਨ ਵਾਲੀ ਸਟੇਟਮੈਂਟ ਹੈ, the Sikh children who had been mute and terrified witness, this was in 2006, he wrote. The Sikh children who had been mute and terrified witness to the brutal killings of their fathers and brothers, molestation of their mothers and sisters, and the plunder and destruction of their homes, have grown up to be angry and bitter young men. 2006 ਚ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ। The widows of the 1984 massacres, waiting patiently for over 2 decades of justice, are growing more bitter and despondent by the day, while their preparators of butchery roam free, some of them even occupying ministerial office. Evidently, the wounds of 1984 will not heal as long as stern action is not taken against those guilty of the carnage. ਇਹ 2006 ਵਿੱਚ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਸੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ। No, this was written in 2006. Since then, another 18 years have passed. ਹੋਰ ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ 18 ਸਾਲ, ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ 2024 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹਾਂ। Of course, organizations like Sikh Forum and some others, by providing relief and continuous fight for justice, Butalia, मेरे बहुत सारे colleagues उन्होंने देखा, मैं भी आया था दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी, they did tremendous job. Hats off to them. Right. Relief and continuous fight for justice. Activist lawyers like H.S. Fulka and his colleagues, with their sustained efforts to get some convictions, including for politically powerful, have provided some succor to the victims and the community. Yet, according to the information which is available with H.S. Fulka, till today, only 27 cases have ended in conviction. Out of that, only 12 cases are conviction for murder. बाकी सब कुछ हाले 40 साल के बाद है. So therefore, as again, when speaking as Vardarajan said, Ahuja Sahab ne kiya कि Sikhs as a community, they have not taken it to that extreme end, but pain of 1984 persists in them. They do expect justice and treatment from their fellow citizens and the state. Already इस टेस्ट में सारा अवॉइड करता है क्योंकि इसके बारे गल हो चुकी है. Another statement from the then Home Minister of India. On 26 December 2014, the then Union Home Minister Rajnath Singh described the November 1984 anti-Sikh carnage as genocide. ये गल मैं भी कही थी, एमनेस्टी इंटरनेशनल सेमिनार कही थी, क्योंकि एमनेस्टी इंटरनेशनल जेनोसाइड वर्ड यूज नहीं करते, सो दे अवॉइडेड, बट आई डिड इट इन ए बुकलेट इन फॉर 25th एनिवर्सरी जो उसी मनाई तां भी मैं गल कही थी. एनीहो, सो this description no doubt was appropriate, but also needs logical and appropriate culmination. Equally important are issues of Operation Blue Star, Woodrose, just in cases of fake encounters, involuntarily disappearance, and so on and so forth. 84 ਦੇ ਇਲਾਵਾ ਇਹ ਸਾਰੇ ਮਾਮਲੇ ਵੀ ਹੈ ਨੇ ਜਿਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਸਟਿਸ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈ closure is required. That needs appropriate closures. Government needs to understand that demand for justice is not merely about a healing touch for the victims and the Sikh community. It is the principle of moral rightness which ought to define the character of the society we live in. Yes, it is also a matter of healing touch and bringing the sufferers out of resentment, despair, and elusive justice. ਇੱਥੋਂ ਮੈਂ ਥੋੜਾ second point ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰਨਾ. Election results in Punjab from 1997 onward, both for parliamentary and state assembly, had made it clear that voters of the state in general have come out of radical politics. Ahuja Sahab ne gal hint ਦਿੱਤਾ ਸੀ, in a big way, to the extent of rehabilitation even of the Congress. ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਾਂਗਰਸ ਤੋਂ ਵੀ ਇੱਕ ਹੱਦ ਤੱਕ ਮਾਫ ਕੀਤਾ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਾ ਦਿਲੀ ਹੈ, ਜਿਹੜੀ broadness ਹੈ among Sikhs, the position even of the Congress among Sikhs. The position of extremists had been reasonably eliminated. But within Sikh community, there also has come to scene post Blue Star generation. ये भी generation आ गई है, थोड़ा एक दोस्त ने भी लिखा है, generation ready to move away from the past events and prepare to let pass the tragic events of 1940, 84 and after. वो generation भी है ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਨੂੰ ਭੁੱਲਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਅੱਗੇ ਚੱਲਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਅੱਗੇ ਸਾਡਾ future ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ. This, however, does not mean that the horrendous events are forgotten and are of no concern. Not only those have been firmly inserted in Sikh history, but also, if not redressed, these will continue to be a tool in the hands of radicals and extremists. This is a little warning to the state, not from my side, it's a general perception. थोड़ा सा मुझे example दे देना. Recent events within Punjab and outside India clearly show that radicals keep the wounds alive by highlighting the persistent failure of the government to address Sikh concerns and grievances like justice to victims of November 1984, no repentance on Operation Blue Star. कोई अफसोस किसी ने जाहिर नहीं किया. पिछे तुसी किताब पढ़ी होनी है आई सी दी रियल स्टोरी ऑफ खालिस्तान. उन्होंने राइटर ने अपनी इंट्रोडक्शन च लिखा कि ਇਹੋ ਜਿਹੀ ਇੱਕ ਮੀਟਿੰਗ 'ਚ ਬੈਠੇ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਜੀ ਮਾਫੀ ਮੰਗ ਦਿਓ, ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਖੜਾ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਮਾਫ ਕਰਨ ਨੂੰ ਤਿਆਰ ਹਾਂ, ਕੋਈ ਮਾਫੀ ਮੰਗੇ ਤਾਂ ਸਹੀ. तो बुक इतों शुरू कर देने कि नारंग ने गल कही सी, तां करके मैं रियलिटी दसने कोई मंगे तो सही, रिपेंटेंस ही नहीं है, तो व्हाट डू यू डू विद दैट. Operation Blue Star, unfair sharing, no repentance on Operation Blue Star, unfair sharing of river waters, agrarian issue, etc., etc. Community is thus kept in a sense of persecution going back to the pre and post independence events of discrimination and unfulfilled promises. If fear रहेगा, अगर issues just नहीं होंगे. For various reasons, a section of the Sikh diaspora, including erstwhile disgruntled politicians, मेरे को डिटेल है, चाहिए तो मैं दे देंगा, have begun raising the demand of Khalistan. Among them, there also are refugees, many victims of police excesses and stories of Operation Blue Star. ਇਹ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੱਕ ਦੋ ਦੇ ਨਾਂ ਲਾ ਦੇਣਾ, ਲੋਕ ਬੰਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਗਏ ਨੇ ਰਿਫਿਊਜੀ ਬਣ ਕੇ, ਵਿਕਟਿਮਸ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਦਿਮਾਗ ਉਹ ਉੱਥੇ ਹੀ ਭਰਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਹੈ. And the number 84 Carnage. In Western liberal democracies, apart from freedom of speech and to propagate, they also are able to get support from a section of the media, and because of those countries' internal electoral politics are accommodated even by the governments. Roots of recent bitterness in relations with Canada and US can easily be traced to the events of 1984. I'm saying this with full sense of responsibility. 80 से जो कुछ है ਉਹਦਾ ਰਿਜ਼ਲਟ ਅੱਜ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਰਿਲੇਸ਼ਨ, ਉੱਥੋਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਟ੍ਰੇਸ ਕਰੋਗੇ ਤਾਂ ਇਟ ਕਮਸ ਫਰਮ ਦੇਅਰ. Recent reports from across the border suggest that Pakistan's ISI is continuing with its long-term policy of bleed India, and because of countries in current internal political situation, has stepped up to its activities of providing logistic and other support to militant groups in India, including Sikhs. In a recent article in Indian Express, मिसल 1 September 2024 की गल है, वंदना मिश्रा pointed out, I quote, please listen it carefully. These crises, जड़े मैं ऊपर mention किते ने, these crises were also part of simmering discontents that bubbled to surface in the farmers' movement. ये नहीं कह रही कि farmers' movement उस करके हुई, but they bubbled up in that also. It is clearly visible that in Punjab, in the prevailing environment of disillusion and agony, once again both radical and moderate politics is using extreme politics to eliminate competition. आपस में जो competition है ना, उन्हें दूर करने वास्ते they start using radical elements. She concludes saying, please listen again, once proud state is in need of closure, that eludes. Mark the words she is using very carefully. Once proud state is in search of closures, that eludes, and a resolution that is still missing. Okay. So coming to my last point, which is about control. मैं इतनी चीज़ तुम याद एक चीज़ तुम दसना कि B.R. अंबेडकर साहब का नाम लिया सी उन्हें सिद्धार्थ ने, उत्थों मैंने याद आ गया कि जो हिंदुस्तान का कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन लागू होया, उस वक्त B.R. अंबेडकर ने बहुत कुछ कहा सी. दो गल्लां बड़ियां इंपॉर्टेंट ने. एक गल उन्होंने ये कही सी कि आज़ादी के बाद सानू इस गल का कोई हक नहीं है कि हर गल की जिम्मेवारी अंग्रेज़ों को दे दी. एक ट्रेडिशन है ना कि एवरीथिंग ब्रिटिश आर रिस्पॉन्सिबल, एंड टुडे एवरीथिंग बिफोर 2014 वाज इंपॉर्टेंट. सैकेंड चीज़ उन्होंने कही सी कि कितना भी अच्छा कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन होए, वो कितना अच्छा काम करेगा ये डिपेंड करता है उन्होंने लागू करने वाले होते हैं. ये दो चीज़ें आज. This is the issue of Sikh politics and misuse of the noble concept of miri piri, fusion of religion and politics. Looked in proper perspective, the underlying idea behind the vision of miri piri has been that politics needs to be run with the sanction of religion. Please, मैं इन्हें आराम ना सुनना जो मैं कह रहा हूँ before reacting to that. The underlying idea behind the vision of Miri Piri has been that politics need to be run with the sanction of religion, and that for proper practice and protection of religion, community needs political power. Community political power चाहिए थी, पर किधर वास्ते चाहिए थी? अपने religion protection वास्ते. From this angle, in ideological terms, acquisition of power is not end in itself. Miri Piri दे वास्ते acquisition of power अपने आप विच end नहीं है, but essentially a means to realize the welfare of the humanity in general. Halimi Raj, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਾਸਤੇ Miri Piri ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ, and of the Sikh community in particular. In another way, it could be interpreted to mean that every act should be undertaken with a sense of religious piety. That is, again, spiritualization of politics, not use of religion for politics. ਇਹ ਮੇਰੀ ਪੀੜ੍ਹੀ ਹੈ। But what has been the practice since the success of Gurdwara Reform Movement, also known as Akali Movement, and ਮੈਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ SGPC ਦੀ, what has been the practice since the success of Gurdwara Movement, also known as the Akali Movement, and the establishment of SGPC. SGPC ਬਣੀ, Akali Movement ਨਾਲ ਬਣੀ, ਲੇਕਿਨ ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਕੀ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ? It is that any group of Sikhs, again an important point, small or large, interested in politics calls themselves as Akali and claim exclusive right to speak in the name of community. और सारे अपने ਨੂੰ अकाली क्यों कहते हैं? Historical consciousness among the Sikhs has led them to consider the Akalis as the legitimate inheritor of Gurdwara administration. Therefore, since the Akalis, since it was the Akalis, not the present day SCD of any time, Akali naam se usre jehdi agitation kar rahe si, since it was the Akalis who had liberated the Gurdwaras, therefore at any time there are so many Akali dals with prefix A, B, C, etc. ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਦਿਮਾਗ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੌਨਸ਼ੀਅਸਲੀ ਪਾਤਾ ਕਿ ਸਿਰਫ ਅਕਾਲੀ ਹੀ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰਾ ਮੈਨੇਜਮੈਂਟ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਨੇ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਲਿਬਰੇਟ ਕਰਾਇਆ ਸੀ। ਐਨੀ ਅਦਰਸ ਇਜ਼ ਦ ਗਵਰਨਮੈਂਟ ਰਿਪਰੈਜ਼ੈਂਟੇਸ਼ਨ, ਉਹ ਸਰਕਾਰੀ ਹੋ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ। Therefore, at any time, etc., ਕੋਈ ਅਕਾਲੀ ਦਲ ਮਾਨ, ਕੋਈ ਅਕਾਲੀ ਦਲ ਅੰਮ੍ਰਿਤਸਰ, etc. For long, so anyhow, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਫਿਰ ਕੋਈ ਇੱਕ ਦਲ ਐਸਾ ਬਣ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਜਿਹਨੂੰ ਪਪੂਲਰ ਸਪੋਰਟ ਮਿਲ ਜਾਂਦਾ, ਔਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਫੈਕਸ਼ਨਿਜ਼ਮ ਆ ਜਾਂਦੀ ਹੈ। With vast resources of SGPC, both human and material, communities' respect for high priests, the Jathedars, a well-lubricated machinery throughout the state to disseminate any ideology, any information, opinion in favor or against a party, a group of individuals, or anybody else. Control over SGP is very important, not only for religious purposes, but equally in the domain of secular politics. Why? No, this is why the elections, SGPC have been over-politicized. The elections are contested on party basis, not only on the issues of Gurdwara management, but also issues purely in the domain of secular politics. The candidates are selected on the basis of their loyalty and proximity to the party bosses. SGPC members, office bearers, and unfortunately, even Jathedars of Takhas owe their position to the party and supreme leaders in the party and not to the community. Sorry using this language, but even Jathedars owe their office to the party and within party, anyhow. So in their struggle for power, the factions and individuals leaders, to show each other down and play with people's emotions, are engaged in one-upmanship and no hold barred politics. This is what happened in 1980s. ਹੁਣ ਮੇਰੇ ਕੋਲ ਟਾਈਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ, ਸਿਰਫ ਮੈਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਦਿੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਮਿਸਿਸ ਇੰਦਰਾ ਗਾਂਧੀ ਨੇ ਐਮਰਜੈਂਸੀ ਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਸਿਰਫ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਾਰੇ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਲੈਕਸ਼ਨ ਲੜਨ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਇਹ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕੀਤੀ ਕਿ ਹੁਣ ਮੈਜੋਰੀਟੇਰੀਅਨ ਕਾਰਡ ਯੂਜ਼ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾਏ। ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਮੇਰੀ ਜਨਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਹੋਣਾ, ਉਹਨੇ ਰੁਦਰਾਕਸ਼ ਮਾਲਾ ਪਾਣੀ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤੀ, ਯੋਗੀਆਂ ਕੋਲ ਜਾਣਾ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰਤਾ, ਬ੍ਰਹਮਚਾਰੀ ਫਲਾਣੇ ਫਲਾਣੇ ਫਲਾਣੇ। And in one or two statements, Mr. Vardhaman, I don't know whether you remember or not, she used majority also has rights. Against whom? Secularism always say the rights of minorities, but she started using majority also has rights and started playing communal politics, and three were targeted: Assam, Kashmir and Punjab. Punjab, why? Because the Sikhs themselves have been using fusion of religion and politics. So ਉਹਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਜੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਹੀ ਤਰੀਕਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਨੇ ਅਗੇਂਸਟ ਯੂਜ਼ ਕਰੋ, ਔਰ ਉਹਨੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਪੋਲਿਟਿਕਸ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰਤੀ ਅਗੇਂਸਟ ਅਕਾਲੀਸ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਦੀ ਕਦੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਸੀ ਪੰਥ ਇਨ ਡੇਂਜਰ ਇਹ ਵਗੈਰਾ, ਉਹਨੇ ਕਿ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਤੇਜ਼ ਬੋਲਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਲਿਆਓ ਅੱਗੇ। ਸਿਰਫ ਇੱਕ ਐਗਜ਼ਾਮਪਲ ਦਿਆਂਗਾ, ਇੱਕ ਸੱਜਣ ਨੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਨਾਮ ਹੈ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਜਗਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਚੌਹਾਨ। ਉਹ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਿਨਿਸਟਰ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ, ਫਸਟ ਅਕਾਲੀ ਮਿਨਿਸਟਰ। ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਉਹ ਚਲੇ ਗਏ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ। ਉੱਥੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ 71 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਨਿਊਯਾਰਕ ਟਾਈਮਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਐਡਵਰਟਾਈਜ਼ਮੈਂਟ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਸੀ ਖਾਲਿਸਤਾਨ ਵਾਸਤੇ, ਔਰ ਇੰਟੈਲੀਜੈਂਸ ਦੀਆਂ ਰਿਪੋਰਟਸ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਉਸ ਐਡਵਰਟਾਈਜ਼ਮੈਂਟ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਫਾਈਨੈਂਸ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ ਵਾਸ਼ਿੰਗਟਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਾਕਿਸਤਾਨ ਅੰਬੈਸੀ ਨੇ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ। ਠੀਕ ਹੈ, ਉਹ 1970 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਆਏ, ਅਕਾਲੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਘਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਪਾਇਆ, ਐਂਡ ਹਾਈਐਸਟ ਲੈਵਲ ਆਫ ਕਾਂਗਰਸ, in this case I'm using name, Dr. Gyani Dayal Singh and Mr. Indira Gandhi met him. ਉੱਥੋਂ ਇਹ ਸਾਰੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਸੈਸ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤਾ। ਪਾਲਿਸੀ ਸਿਰਫ ਇੱਕ ਸੀ, ਟੂ ਟ੍ਰੈਪ ਅਕਾਲੀਸ, ਟੂ ਟ੍ਰੈਪ ਅਕਾਲੀਸ। ਅਕਾਲੀ ਉਸ ਟ੍ਰੈਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬਹੁਤ ਈਜ਼ੀਲੀ ਆ ਗਏ। ਸਿਰਫ ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਐਗਜ਼ਾਮਪਲ, 1982 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇੱਕ ਅੰਦੋਲਨ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ ਪਾਣੀ ਦੇ ਬਟਵਾਰੇ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ, ਉਹ ਫੁਲਕਾ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਕੀ ਸੀ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਉਹ, ਨਹੀਂ ਧਰਮਜੋਤ ਬਾਅਦ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਇਆ ਜੀ, ਉੱਥੇ ਤੋਂ ਮੈਂ ਕਹਿ ਰਿਹਾ, ਉਹ ਮੋਰਚਾ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ, ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਦਾ ਨਾਂ ਦਿਮਾਗ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੇਰੇ ਆ ਗਿਆ ਹੁਣ, ਇੱਕ ਮਿੰਟ, ਕਪੂਰੀ, ਕਪੂਰੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਜੀ, ਕਪੂਰੀ ਉਹ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਇਸ ਵੱਲ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਸੀ, ਚੱਕਦਾ ਸੀ, ਉੱਥੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਮੋਰਚਾ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ, ਉਹਦੇ 'ਚ ਹੋਰ ਪਾਰਟੀਆਂ ਵੀ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸੀ। ਇਹ ਅਪ੍ਰੈਲ 1982 ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ। ਠੀਕ ਹੈ, ਜਦੋਂ ਰੈਡੀਕਲਿਜ਼ਮ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਮੋਰਚਾ ਕਪੂਰੀ ਚੁੱਕ ਕੇ ਹਰਿਮੰਦਰ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਲਿਆਂਦਾ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਧਰਮ ਯੁੱਧ ਦਾ ਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਉਹ ਮੋਰਚਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਾਰੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਸੀ, ਉਹਦੀਆਂ ਦੂਸਰੀਆਂ ਪਾਰਟੀਆਂ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸੀ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਧਰਮ ਯੁੱਧ ਦਿੱਤਾ, ਬਾਕੀ ਪਾਰਟੀਆਂ ਅਲੱਗ ਹੋ ਗਈਆਂ। ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਹੈ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਗੱਲ ਬੜੀ ਕਲੀਅਰ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਅਕਾਲੀ ਇਸ ਬੇਵਕੂਫੀ 'ਚ ਗਏ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੰਦਰਾ ਗਾਂਧੀ ਨਾਲ ਨੈਗੋਸ਼ੀਏਸ਼ਨਸ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੱਢ ਕਰ ਲਾਂਗੇ। ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਕਿ ਇੰਦਰਾ ਗਾਂਧੀ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਕੁਝ ਵੀ ਦੇਣ ਨੂੰ ਤਿਆਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ, ਨੈਗੋਸ਼ੀਏਸ਼ਨ ਦਾ ਕੋਈ ਮਤਲਬ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ, ਉਹਦਾ ਪਰਪਸ ਸਿਰਫ ਇੱਕੋ ਸੀ, ਟੂ ਟ੍ਰੈਪ ਦੀ ਅਕਾਲੀਸ ਐਂਡ ਮੇਕ them fools and declare them separatists. एंड अकाली उस ट्रैप में बड़े फंस गए और वो सारा कुछ हो गया। फिर लास्ट लाइन लैके मैं ख़त्म कर देना क्योंकि इतना और टाइम नहीं है। ओके, सो वर्ड अगेन मैं यूज करना रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी एंड पॉलिटिक्स, द सिख लीडरशिप एंड सेक्शंस ऑफ द कम्युनिटी इफ नॉट रिस्पॉन्सिबल, मैं नहीं कह रही कोई रिस्पॉन्सिबल नहीं, बिकेम पार्ट ऑफ द प्रोसेस, जाने अनजाने वो भी अपनी पॉलिटिक्स करके, इन ऑपरेशन ब्लू स्टार, assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and massacre of the Sikhs. ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਉਹ ਇਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਉਹਦੇ ਸ਼ਾਮਲ ਸੀ, ਪਰ ਉਹ ਕਾਰਨ ਬਣ ਗਏ। ਔਰ ਅੱਜ ਫਿਰ ਅਨਫੋਰਚੂਨੇਟਲੀ ਉਹ ਸਿਚੁਏਸ਼ਨ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆ ਗਈ ਹੈ। ਤਾਂ ਕਰਕੇ ਮੈਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਹੀ ਹੈ, ਅੱਜ ਫਿਰ ਅਕਾਲੀ ਦਲ ਔਰ ਜਥੇਦਾਰਾਂ ਦਾ ਇਸਤੇਮਾਲ ਉਸ ਕੰਮ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ। ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕੇਅਰਫੁਲ ਰਹਿਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਠੀਕ ਹੈ, ਸ਼ਾਇਦ 84 ਵਗੈਰਾ ਰਿਪੀਟ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਣਗੇ, ਪਰ ਖਤਰੇ ਹਮੇਸ਼ਾ ਆਲਵੇਜ਼ बने रहते हैं। इस करके सानू अपने सिख पॉलिटिक्स पर भी नज़र रखनी चाहिए। थैंक यू वेरी मच।
आप खुद पूछिए कि 1984 के कत्लेआम के बारे में कितनी फिल्में बनी हैं। अमू एक फिल्म याद आता है मुझे, सोनाली बोस की फिल्म। माचिस में थोड़ा सा जिक्र है 84 के कत्लेआम का, बट प्रीटी मच दैट्स इट। पंजाब में पंजाबी वाली फिल्म नहीं है, लेकिन जैसे खालड़ा पे फिल्म बनाने की कोशिश की जा रही है, उसको दबाने की भी कोशिश की जा रही है। तो मेरा मानना है कि किताबों के ज़रिए, गाना, कविताओं के ज़रिए, फिल्मों के ज़रिए डॉक्यूमेंटेशन होना बहुत ज़रूरी है। मैं 2002 में जब गुजरात में कत्लेआम हुए तो मैंने एक किताब तैयार किया 2002 के बारे में, इसीलिए क्योंकि मुझे फिक्र था, मुझे डर था कि हमारे आंखों के सामने जो सब हो रहा है, इसको अगर हम आज कैप्चर नहीं करेंगे और वो भी एक परमानेंट किताब के फॉर्म में, तो शायद 10 साल बाद, 20 साल बाद ये बात मिट जाएगी। और मुझे अफसोस इस बात पे आती है कि किताब भी निकला और उसके बावजूद भी इस चीज़ को मिटाने की पूरी तरह से कोशिश की जा रही है। तो दिस इज़ अ स्ट्रगल विच इज़ वेरी डिफिकल्ट टू विन। दूसरी बात कि ये इसको याद रखना इसलिए ज़रूरी है और इसलिए हम लोग करेंगे क्योंकि 84 के कत्लेआम को अंजाम देने वाले आज भी हमारे साथ मौजूद हैं। उनके नाम अलग हैं, चेहरे अलग हैं, उनके पार्टी के निशान अलग हो सकते हैं, लेकिन जो इरादा, तरीका, मंसूबा वो बदला नहीं है। बंटवारे की मानसिकता जो है वो पूरी तरह से हावी है, और जब तक ये लोग अपना काम करेंगे तब तक हम इस चीज़ को कभी भूल नहीं पाएंगे। हाँ, 40 साल बाद 50, मतलब कि एक डायरेक्ट मेमोरी नहीं होगी, लेकिन हर तकरीर पे जब आप रिएक्ट करोगे, किसी नेता की तकरीर, जैसे आज हम सुन रहे हैं झारखंड से खुल के हिंदू मुस्लिम वाली बातें हो रही हैं, ये भी 1984 के दर्द को ताज़ा कर रहा है, और इसलिए हम इसको भुला नहीं सकते. So I think it's very important to ensure that this is kept alive for this very reason, that the problems are all around us.
I think all three panelists have given their views on what happened and why it is necessary for documentation and the need for introspection. I think for that, one full day session need to be given to Narang Saab, because he's written a book on Akali politics and what has led us to this kind of a situation. How the community got exploited into an event of Blue Star and followed by the assassination and the consequences of it thereafter. So community introspection is very, very important, and documentation through seminars, through hard books, through YouTube, everything is extremely necessary. I have been to Auschwitz in Austria, where the Jews concentration camp is located. That camp has been maintained till today, not for any revenge, but to remind the people what the particular community has gone through. Halanki, in Austria there are no Jews now, but Austrian government has maintained that. So record keeping in whatever form is very, very important. Other thing, in my opinion, which is very important is to know that India has changed in the last 40 years. India has changed in a huge way. Media, both print as well as social media and TV. You see what's happening in the last 15, 20 years. I am from armed forces. We never thought of ये हिंदू मुस्लिम सिख ईसाई कौन है. इकट्ठे खाना, इकट्ठे ट्रेनिंग, इकट्ठे दुश्मन से लड़ना, इकट्ठे जीत के आना. But today, even amongst the retired Hindu friends, sorry to say this part, but very dear friends, they don't hesitate to, the system has been polarized so much, like it was covered by Saji, that when a prime minister of a country can make a statement of what it was said, then you know where you are headed. Overall, the patience and the tolerance of the community, of the communities rather, of the nation has come down. This is a hard reality. It's a hard reality. Just 6 years back, a gentleman who's conducting classes for IAS, IPS training center in Rajendra Nagar narrated a situation where he had gone to buy, he was living here only, now in Chandigarh, he had gone to buy vegetables. At the vegetable vendor, there was a lady who was discussing, or rather in conversation with the vendor, bargaining on the price. And that guy is saying, madam, hum to garib aadmi hain, ye hai. So this gentleman made the mistake of interjecting into it. कि बेचारा गरीब है, मैडम आप तो लग रहे हो अमीर हो, ठीक है. So she asked him, who are you? आपको 84 याद नहीं है? What I'm trying to say is, the memories have not faded away. Environment has changed. Media, I would say, is more negative than the positive. The polarization at its peak happening. Our next generation of the community has to live in this environment. We all have to live in this environment and survive. The biggest factor of the Sikh community is resilience. Even having, pre-partition, in our history where there were time, during the Mughal time, there was a bounty on a Sikh head. You bring a Sikh head and you'll get so much of reward. These are realities. These are realities of today. Yet within that, and classical example is, I would say, with a lot of respect to Fulka Sahib, persistent effort over so many years, which has culminated in some kind of a justice. And remember, 84 happened, thereafter, as Sir covered, Gujarat, Delhi the latest. What has changed? Nothing much. Nothing much. So when the state gets involved directly or indirectly, it's not a good thing for the future of the nation. Yes, we are progressing, our economy is going up, everything, but it's basically not good for the nation. So documentation is very important. In whatever form, conduct of seminars, remind the younger generation, they can read in their own time, translate into Singh, look at our own politics, what's happening. I'm saying Akali politics, the dominant politics. And look the way the nation has changed over the 40 years, environmental factor, media, polarization, patience less, tolerance less, all combined. This is the reality. Thank you very much, eminent panelists, for your contribution in the whole thing. And thanks, Sikh Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think our appreciation is a set of books which we are going to give to all the panelists, and also a coffee table book on Rapab to Nagara. A copy is being given to all. I just want to show it to the audience too. This is a big book which was brought out by Mr. Nag, and this is also being given to all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much once again.